tight end is a frequently mocked position for the Cincinnati Bengals in the 2023 NFL Draft. Let's talk about what they need at the position, positional value, and then take a look at some individual prospects in a tight end special on Locked On Bengals.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow, joined today by Joe Goodberry and Mike Santagata at Joe Goodberry, at Bengals_Sands. Man, when I say your name, instead of just introducing you as Mike at Bengals_Sands Santagata, it gets really confusing. We're going to talk about tight ends today on Locked On Bengals, covering your team, the Cincinnati Bengals, every day on the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can be an everyday listener, join the Everyday Club, and join that first listen club. You can subscribe on YouTube. You can follow anywhere you get your podcasts to join those clubs more easily. Today's episode brought to you by Ultimate Football GM, and if you want to draft a tight end in the first round, this game is for you. Check it out at ultimate-gm.com or in the App Store and get a 100% free boost to your franchise using promo code LOCKEDON in all caps in the game. Guys, we're going to dive into the tight end position today. One of a few, I think, positions very frequently mocked to the Bengals in the first round, a position that we've spent a lot of time talking about in this podcast, a position that we've watched a lot of personally in our time. You look at our draft sheet, very filled out for the tight end position. Before we talk about some of the individual prospects, and Dalton Kincaid, of course, visited the Bengals this week after he got his medical clearance, and we'll talk about Dalton Kincaid and how he may or may not fit with the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's talk about the position on the whole, right? You look around the NFL, and there's George Kittle, and there's Travis Kelce, and then there's a huge gap. There's some other really good tight ends in the NFL. TJ Hawkinson, when he's healthy, you can talk about Darren Waller as well. He's not managed to stay healthy very often lately. It's an interesting position. It's a position that has a ton of upside when you think about some of the most potent tight ends in history. And it's a position that carries a lot of developmental time at other times, and other times just doesn't move the needle very much. So let's start there with positional value, because we're talking about a first round, second round pick at this point for the Bengals as they try for probably the second straight year here to find a spot in the draft to pick a tight end. And Joe, let's start with you. On principle, in a vacuum, I asked you this question, I think, in DMs the other day. Where are you on the value of a tight end for the Bengals offense?
Yeah, so it's probably, I would put it in tiers, a quarterback being a tier on its own, but then you've got tackle, wide receiver, right, in an offense, and in the importance, probably maybe even center is the next one to bridge the gap between what I think would be interior offensive line, tight end, and running back. As it's not that they're least valuable or they don't impact the game enough. You can make cases for each one of those points. I think part of value is factoring in the replacement cost, or where you can find another player, whether that be in free agency, where guards don't get paid as well as tackles, right? But guards definitely get paid more than tight ends and running backs do. So I'd probably slot tight end and running back below those guys. And then in the draft, same thing with guards and tight end and running back. The best bet to draft one in terms of value or finding or rolling the dice in the right time would probably be in between rounds 2 and 4, based on data and history that I've looked at. And I think what that means is the replacement cost for those guys is inherently cheaper than any of the premium positions on offense and defense.
Mike, when you think about this position as it pertains to the Bengals, how much can you move the needle? Say they hit a grand slam, maybe not a grand slam, because a grand slam is those two guys, or Rob Gronkowski, like the truly game-changing tight ends. But say they pick a tight end in the first round and he's who they hope he is. Does that get them over the hump? Is that the missing piece? Could that be so valuable as to maybe historically, the best value is in the second to fourth round, but if they do hit in the first round, how big of a deal is that in your opinion?
Yeah. So for me, the tight end value is that tier of dudes like Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, George Kittle, etc. And then big drop offs to the next group, because that's invaluable. That I think you'd put up there just as valuable in some cases, maybe even a little more valuable than wide receiver. But once you get past those guys, now you're into these guys can start, they make the offense function a little bit. And I think it's a little bit harder to find those than it seems. You can see that with some of the deals that go around with tight end. But they're really just making the offense function because you're always going to have a tight end on the field in the NFL, whether it's 11 personnel, 12 personnel. Not many teams are running 20 and very few are running 10. The last guy who ran 10, he took the one-way train ticket. It was Cliff Kingsbury. So you always got a tight end on the field, and you need a guy that's functional because they are hard to find. They're hard to develop. I think it's hard to say that these guys are going to take them over the top. Just one of these guys, at least. But I don't want to diminish the value either, because if they really do hit hard and you get a Dalton Schultz type or somebody of that nature where they're really good. They're just, how much does the needle move? Probably less than you'd like for a round one pick, but at the same time, you're solidifying a spot that needs to be on the field and make the offense function without having to always take a roll of the dice. They've done a great job with these 1-year deals, but what if one of them doesn't pan out? Because these 1-year guys, they don't always pan out. They're getting low money for a reason. Maybe it doesn't work, and now you've got a guy that makes the offense function. That's at least my opinion on the whole thing. Although I will say, I think Kincaid and Washington could add value. They're just more risky than trying to get a guy that just gets the offense functioning.
And we'll talk about the risks for some of these guys as well, because to me, how many runs for the Bengals got blown up for minimal gain or for a loss because their tight ends just couldn't block last year? Something
Countless.
that we've talked about, right? Joe, you've said this. We talked about it on the podcast before. It was a big issue. And so, all this discussion about the running game and running back for the Bengals, a lot of that problem, maybe not a lot of that, but a not insignificant amount of that problem is that their tight ends were not good enough blocking last year in the run game. I'm not talking about pass blocking. And then on the receiving side of things, Hayden Hurst was fine, but wasn't dynamic by most measures of dynamism, wasn't great after the catch, was good, was always grinding out those yards in critical situations. He was clutch, but he wasn't explosive after the catch in the way that, some of those top tier tight ends are. And finding a guy that can do both of those teams to give you just a little bit more juice in the passing game, but also be more effective and more consistent in the running game. So you're not getting blown up behind the line of scrimmage because maybe your offensive line did okay, but your tight end couldn't seal the backside, and that backside crashed down and just caught somebody before they could get through the line of scrimmage. That, keeping your offense on schedule, you talk about keeping the offense functional, Mike, is kind of hidden value that you don't often think about with tight ends in terms of keeping you in a 2nd and 5 and how valuable is being in a 2nd and 5 versus a 2nd and 8, or keeping you in a 3rd and 1 instead of a 3rd and 8 in those situations where like maybe you have a 2nd and 5 run and you lose 3 yards because of your tight end for whatever reason. And obviously it's never so simple, but that's just to speak to the hidden value of a tight end and where I think for the Bengals, you could get a year one impact. At the same time, as we're going to talk about with these guys, we're going to dive into them individually here for the rest of the show. When's the last time you saw a tight end come into the NFL and do all of these things well right away? There's development time, and there's so much intricacy to the position in terms of aligning all over the field, blocking responsibilities in different schemes, and then having to be a receiver on top of that. There's a reason those top guys are so good and so valuable, and there's a reason that they're so rare. We're going to talk about some of these individual prospects coming up next and what some of them offer and where the upside is, where the risk is. And it's going to be a whole show of talking tight ends. Just wanted to get some of that value and Bengals specific stuff out of the way from a philosophical perspective before we dive into some of these details. We're going to get into the prospects coming up next. Today's episode brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. We've talked about the game on this program plenty. And if you're the kind that's running these mock draft simulators to death in the offseason, you want to get through your own draft, you want to make your own dynasty, Ultimate Football GM is the game for you. You can manage your coaching staff, manage your free agency, manage your draft board, manage your scouting, hire the right scouts, set up your team the way you want to set it up with Ultimate Football GM, and you're going to get a 100% boost to your franchise right now using promo code LOCKEDON in all caps. You don't need to be online to play this game either. So if you're the type that's going to be flying a lot, you want to run a football simulator while you're flying, Check the game out. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDON in all caps for a 100% boost to your game. Ultimate-GM.com, or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-GM.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. All right, guys, let's pull up our draft sheet here and talk through the prospects. Joe, I'm going to kick it over to you. I've been talking for a long time consecutively here, and I would like to stop doing that. And we're going to do that by letting you talk about the draft class overall here. This is, of course, the draft sheet that we're going to publish a little bit later on. We've been doing this project for 5 years now?
Yeah.
Where we're taking film grades and baking in all sorts of factors to try to come up with risk profiles for these prospects. But let's talk about this class in general, right? Because it's been touted as a very strong class. And then you look at our grades in here, and you look at our grades for the tight end class last year, and is it really that strong of a class, Joe?
It's funny because I think when we talked about this class originally, we said there could be 2 or 3 guys that go in the first round. I think that gave the illusion that it's very strong. And those guys could be Michael Mayer, Dalton Kincaid, and Luke Musgrave. But then we get all of the data and all the information, everything gets churned about. And I also think this overall class as a whole isn't very strong. Maybe it's more indicative that 3 guys could go, maybe even 4 guys in the top 45 or so. Probably means that the receiver class isn't great, and you could see teams taking tight ends instead. And I could definitely see that happening. But as a whole, I don't think there's a slam dunk tight end in this class still. We've had years in the past with O.J. Howard, T.J. Hawkinson, more recent years, where those guys ended up going in the top 15, and pretty much everyone felt really good about them. If the consensus top guy, and he still is right now, surprisingly, is Michael Mayer, I think there are still some reservations in his game in terms of how special of an athlete is he? How much does he take your passing offense to another level? Is he that kind of guy? As we talked about in the first segment, the rare guys, the super special tight ends are great. You want them. You'd love to find one. Or is he just going to end up in the pack with the other 20 starters in the NFL that are quality starters? And if that's the case, is that worth a top 25 or so pick? And even up to 28, obviously, this pertains to the Bengals. But that's the question everyone's going to have to answer. I think it's a good class overall. I think it drops off. There's really nobody in day 3 that I'd love to take a dart throw at, which really sours the class for me in a lot of ways. I like to have those guys of, whenever you do the mock draft simulators, you go, well, I didn't get this guy in the 4th round. That's okay. I'll take a couple dart throws in the 5th, 6th, 7th round or whatever and feel good about my chances. I don't feel that way in this class. I do think we'll end up with 8 or so starters. I just think there's a lot of incomplete profiles or guys that have 8 out of 10 things or 9 out of 10 in some cases. And it's like, yeah, but he's currently injured. Yeah, but he didn't test. Yeah, but he doesn't have the receiving production. Whatever the case may be, everyone seems to be missing something.
Yeah, but he turns 25 this year, as we see a lot of red just indicating guys over the age of 23 in our age column here. A lot of older prospects in this class, as we're still seeing some of the effects of COVID years later with the extra eligibility for some of these players. Mike, let's get your overall thoughts on the class here as we look at things here and we compare grades, right? Like you have similar grades this year to last year for guys that didn't make it into the first round.
Yeah, some of that's just I love Dulcich last year, man. The way he moved as a receiver, I ended up with a higher grade on him than I did Kincaid, and I feel like people are more amped up on Kincaid as this receiving tight end, and he's got better hands, and he's probably a better contested catch guy. But I just thought the way that Dulcich kind of like set things up, moved, and did all his routes was very wide receiver-like, very deceptive, very he can be crisp, he can be loose. It just felt very much like he could step in the league and be a receiving tight end. Dalton Kincaid, he's one speed, man. He's full speed ahead, and he's going to make his cut at full speed. And it's kind of cool. You get in and out of your break that fast, but you want tempo things. You want to set things up a little bit better. My thoughts overall on the class are just, for everything I heard, it was underwhelming. Everything I heard about this is going to be one of the best tight end classes we've ever seen. Type stuff coming from like the talking heads in January-ish, when I have no idea who these guys are, and I just hear like Mel Kiper say that and go, oh, that's awesome, Bengals need a tight end. And then I start watching, I'm like, most of these guys I'd be fine with that pick. I'd be fine with that. Nobody I'm jazzed up to really take. So I think Mayer to me was the best just because he's balanced. I think that's an okay first round pick. But if you're going to talk about the tiers, he is probably going to fall in that quality starter tier. If you try to build out like a boom, bust, and middle ground, that middle ground is probably like 80% of his portfolio, maybe 75. And then you've got like 10, 15 for the boom. And then I think his bust chance is kind of low. I think he actually enters the league as a good receiver. Just the array of releases he has, and he's a smooth athlete. You don't usually see tight ends release well like that coming into the NFL. That's one of the big things. It's like, well, you could jam rookie tight ends. Just just put a guy up over him, have him slap him in the chest, and until he figures out how to get off of that, he's a little bit toast. And I think Mayer is actually going to be able to thrive in those situations.
And his 10-yard split saved his RAS too, so that makes sense on the release.
I was pretty impressed with his overall refinement in his game as well, in all aspects of the game, right? Like he can do enough as a blocker where you can project his NFL blocking ability. He can run routes well enough. He knows how to get open, which is one of those very subjective, unquantifiable things, but you can see him setting up his routes and getting open. And I think that's also true of Dalton Kincaid. You talked about Dulcich's route running earlier, Mike. I think Kincaid is a really good route runner as well. I think that he's a better route runner than Mayer, but I think that Mayer does more than enough there given his athletic limitations. And that's really the flaw for Mayer, right? Like if Mayer was the, say, TJ Hawkinson level athlete, he's probably a TJ Hawkinson level tight end. And Hawkinson, for those of you that weren't following us a few years ago, was like a top 10 prospect in that class for us. Like he was very, very highly graded for us in the end because he was a complete package. And Mayer checks all of those boxes: the age box, the productivity box, the skill box, except the athleticism just isn't where you want to be to project that ceiling comfortably. And so he can come in and be a very good tight end. And he's drawn like Jason Witten comparisons, I think, is one I've seen. Joe, what's your comparison? I know you said you have comparisons ready for all these guys.
I do. So Mayer, in a lot of ways, his release, his breaks at the top of his route for not being a tremendous athlete. That was the thing with Witten. He was a 4.75 guy, not a great guy after the catch, not a tremendous athlete, but was really understood his own body positioning and what his athleticism offered. And when you can do that, when you have that, I think you can be a really nuanced route runner. And I think Michael Mayer has that. But I also see the ball skills better than what Witten had. Tremendous hands, but like he was never jumping, leaping in the air, contested catches situation. I see more Mark Andrews-ish in that downfield, and I think he could potentially be that. Andrews also tested very similar to Mayer. So like I see the shades of those. And if you're saying it's a mix of those two guys, that's probably a Pro Bowl tight end, and you would take that. And that's why if a team believes that's what he is, they're going to run to the podium and put that card in.
The Mark Andrews point is really important to point out here because they tested incredibly similarly. I was doing a podcast with James, I think, and I was just randomly, I went to look up Mark Andrews RAS when we were talking about the way Mayer tested. And it's very close in a lot of ways. And nobody's looking at Mark Andrews and saying, yeah, man, if only he was more athletic. Like if he was more athletic, obviously he would be a better player. Like he'd be more dynamic. He would do more, but like, he's not wanting for athleticism, and tested very similarly to Mayer. Mayer's young coming out for this class. There are two guys that really check that age box really hard. It's him and Darnell Washington. Couldn't be much different as prospects.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Washington's a unicorn. He's so different from all these guys. Let's dive into Darnell Washington a little bit here coming up next. We still have a lot of prospects to talk about, so might need to go a little bit faster through some of these guys, but Washington brings with him a conversation about a scheme change. And we talked with Max Toscano, Mike and I did a few weeks ago about some of these ideas, and Max wrote about it as well. You can go find his article I retweeted talking about the Bengals offense. So Darnell Washington could be kind of a portal into some of those ideas. We'll talk about that to finish the show here coming up next. All right, Mike, let's go Darnell Washington. Let's talk about him. He is a giant. I'm going to scroll over so the people watching on YouTube can see the measurables. 6'6.5", 264, 34 plus inch arms, 11 inch hands, and ran a 4.64. Doesn't play like he runs a 4.64 necessarily. Has the productivity you want, tested like an elite athlete with elite size. Blocks great in space. We've talked about some of these things. Could facilitate a future move to 12 personnel, right? He could be the key, right? Tell me about it.
Yeah, the idea would be if you get Darnell Washington, you're probably going to have a receiving tight end with him, and that could be Irv Smith, who is more of a receiving tight end, smooth mover type. And the idea is when you get in the 12 personnel, you're going to create a conflict for the defense because you're going to be able to run the heck out of the ball now, especially if you get under center. So does defense want to live in too high? Stop Jamar Chase, stop T. Higgins, stop the explosive plays like they want to do. Even when the Bengals were in gun and they were a top 3 rushing efficiency, defense still, they didn't come out of too high. They're staying they're staying too high during all of that. You didn't get them to come down into cover 3 and blow them up like the Bengals did in 2021. So the idea of moving to 12, and you've got Darnell Washington, who I think is the best blocking tight end, not Rob Gronkowski, in space that maybe I've ever seen. Every single time D1 athletes are just getting put on their butts when he gets them in space. That part's insane to me. He's got a little work to do as an inline guy, and I think he does have high potential there. But in space, like the screen game and all these other things where you just come up with the idea of let's pull him around. Let's just get this guy blocking a corner, blocking a safety in space, the overhang, and take advantage of that. So you could create the conflict with the 12 personnel and trying to get the defense to come down and have an explosive running game off of that. Run game just better. You got more bodies to block. And maybe he can develop into that receiver eventually because he has the athleticism. And the thing that was surprising about his testing wasn't really the 40. It was I think it was a short shuttle. He ended up really having a really good short shuttle. Mm-hmm. And that's something I don't think showed up on film, but maybe signifies he's just, game's moving a little fast, or maybe, he's he's just a little awkward still. He was 21 the entire season. So it's perfectly normal to think that he could become a more fluid athlete over the next couple of years. And if he can, I think he's got the best potential in the class. It's a big swing, and you could certainly whiff.
He's also in an offense with Brock Bowers. So when you talk about how he is used as a receiver, how he's used in general, you've got a Brock Bowers who's lining up in the slot for them quite a lot. He's their primary receiver in that offense, is going to be the top tight end prospect, most likely whenever he comes out, barring a change in circumstance or something unforeseen happening. So there's that impacting the way that he's deployed, probably the way he's coached at Georgia, the way he developed at Georgia. I do think he has the ability to develop as a receiver. He's never going to be as snappy in and out of his breaks as Michael Mayer, Dalton Kincaid, or Sam Laporta, or, even Tucker Kraft, Luke Musgrave. But there is some natural ability there as a receiver. Like, it's not in terms of the way he catches the ball, it's in terms of the way he moves, in terms of his athletic ability to go up and get the ball when he needs to, in terms of just his size. He's just long. He's a big target who's not necessarily great outside his frame, but has some ability outside his frame. Joe, what do you think about Darnell Washington? And I guess, like, who are the other guys that you're considering? Because I think we're all considering Mayer at 28 if he's available. Washington, despite being the second guy on our board here, is essentially a tie for the next 4 guys. It's Darnell Washington, Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, Tucker Kraft. There's a little bit of separation there when you talk about Tucker Kraft, but those are all guys from 75.8 to 76.8 on our grading scale.
Yeah, so I think Washington can develop more as a receiver. At the very least right now, I think you can hit him in the flats, let him run over guys or jump over guys. And you see defenders peeling themselves off the ground with any contact with Darnell Washington. He really is a beast out there. I think he could provide a lot of that after the catch spark you got with Hayden Hurst in a lot of ways. But I think he is better vertically. He's better up the seam. And especially down in the red zone. I think he can be a definite weapon down there. I agree. I think outside of his frame for being a big guy, although he had that highlight in the combine where he reached behind Odell Beckham almost, one-hander. I do think he struggles outside of his frame, and I think he doesn't get the explosiveness because he's not as sudden. If you have to make a micro adjustment and change your body direction and go, he doesn't have that type of athleticism, or at least it doesn't appear that way. When you're that big, you often get that giant syndrome, like Ant-Man running through that final scene in Endgame. Looks like he's in slow motion, but he's actually covering a lot of ground in that scene. You get that with Darnell Washington. He does get yards after the catch. He does get upfield pretty quickly. His 40 was great. But he looks like he's moving in slow motion in a lot of ways. There is a lot of upside there, but he just doesn't have the receiving production to make teams very comfortable, I think, with a top 25-ish pick. So I think he goes a little bit after that. Dalton Kincaid is the next guy we're probably going to talk about because I think he would have graded higher had he have tested, because he didn't test. He had a back injury that he was medically cleared for. Had he have tested, I think he would have been like a 9.5 RAS kind of guy, right? I think he would have been an elite athlete. It would have put his grade into the tight end 2 range. I mocked this up earlier. It would have been about a 78 and some change. That would have made him tight end 2. I think he's in the discussion for probably the most complete receiving tight end, the most dynamic receiving tight end. If you want today's NFL offenses where you're going to let him be a slot receiver, let him be a move guy, create mismatches, let him because I think he's really underrated after the catch. Because one of the underrated aspects that I think of, like a Travis Kelce, is how quickly you can turn from a receiver and snap to a runner, right? If you don't fight the ball like Darnell Washington, sometimes he struggles to turn and become that runner. But like a Kelce and a Kincaid, I think they instant lightning turn and they're runners right after the catch. And I think that adds a lot of value. I think tight end is a very sleeper position when we talk about yak ability. For, if you were to rank receiver, running back, tight end in terms of how you're going to create explosive yak plays, I would think everyone would put tight end below them, but I think it is a very underrated position to create those. And I think Kincaid can be that guy, and probably the best natural ball skills, hands catcher in this entire class at tight end.
And that's reflected in his PFF drop rate, which if you're watching on YouTube, you saw is like 1.6%, which is by far the best in the class, really without peer, except for there's one other player that was in the blue, which is where you want to be. I guess a couple other, Davis Allen, Blake Whitehart, and Noah Gindorf. But none of those guys you're talking about with premium picks, right? So Dalton Kincaid, for me, for anyone watching on YouTube, you can see the film grades here. I give him essentially the same film grade as Mayer, but the difference is that you're not asking him to block. And I think that there's something to work with there. I think he gets better as the year goes on. I think he's okay in space, and you can live with him in space. But you watch his first couple games of the year, you watch him against Florida, and it's like, this is a slot receiver. This is Mike Gesicki. He's literally never blocking anyone in the NFL. So there's some flags there with Kincaid, right? Because for me, on tape, it's very easy to make an argument that you should say, oh yeah, pick Kincaid before Michael Mayer. He's going to do these things better than Mayer, be more dynamic in these ways for your receiving game. But then we look at the profile here, and he's 2 years older than Mayer. So if you're comparing them as prospects, you're comparing Michael Mayer's rookie year and second year in the NFL to the 2 years of Dalton Kincaid's college productivity, which is when he was 22 and 23. Mayer will be 22 and 23 as a rookie and second-year player. You're talking about an injury history for Kincaid. You're talking about a player that's been great since high school in Mayer, so a much longer track record. And then there's like small size differences, but it's not like Mayer has great size either. He has okay size, so it's not like that's a huge difference there. That's a bit of a flag for both of them. And in general, like a bit of a small tight end class outside of Darnell Washington. As you look at some of the other guys here, Sam Laporta, Tucker Kraft, both kind of in that slightly, I guess Tucker Kraft's probably got average size. Sam Laporta certainly a little bit undersized as well. Let's talk about the rest of this class, though, because, well, actually, first let's do this. Kincaid or Mayer for you guys in the first round, based on I guess for both of you, you have a higher tape grade. So I guess it's easy for you, but based on like upside, I mean, does it get a little bit challenging for you to make that distinction?
It does not for me. I want the guy with the most complete profile. I think I can work with the above average athleticism of Mayer, being young. And I think the few guys that have outperformed average testing in a lot of ways historically are guys that are young coming into the league. And, 22 isn't like super young, but compared to the class, Mayer is going to be a young rookie, and I think he'll get better as he goes. It's not it's easy for me because Kincaid wasn't able to test and really prove what he is.
If you just mean upside, I guess I could see Kincaid having the higher upside, like I did with Washington too. But I think that's a sneaky bust chance because Mike Gesicki to me is kind of a bust. And if you take Dalton Kincaid at 28 and he ends up Mike Gesicki, that's not a good pick. I'd rather have what Michael Mayer does because I think he'll come into the league a little bit more refined and able to do everything. So I think the bust chance on him is a little bit bigger, but maybe that boom chance, maybe that's a little bit bigger, or at least what the boom is going to be a larger boom. I think that he has the potential to be one of the game-changing types. How high of a chance is that? And like you mentioned, the incomplete profile, maybe it's not even really that big.
Yeah, it's always hard when the guys have the incomplete profiles because every year we go through this and it's like, man, yeah, on tape, you can see it easy. Like, yeah, he is a very natural receiver. Like he's refined in the way that he does all these parts of his game as a route runner. He's got great hands. He's great after the catch. And then the profile is just, they're just missing those check marks. Michael Mayer, also a captain, noteworthy, something the Bengals will like, although worth pointing out that Dalton Kincaid was on the leadership council at Utah, which was a 12-player expanded kind of captaincy thing. They also had captains, but then they also had this leadership council. So some leadership points for Dalton Kincaid. But I think where the Bengals are, I think there's a chance they draft Michael Mayer in the first round. I think they're probably playing in the second round. And I wonder which of these guys might make it to them in the second round. And this is a problem with the class a little bit if you're the Bengals, where last year we know they wanted to draft a tight end and it never quite worked out because guys went right before they were comfortable picking them. Is that going to be the case again this year, where like Sam Laporta could be gone mid-second round? Darnell Washington could be late first, early second. Dalton Kincaid could be the first tight end picked based on what we're seeing in mock drafts lately. Tucker Kraft, are they going to be comfortable pulling the trigger on the small school guy in the second round? Will he even be available in the second round? Luke Musgrave, plenty of questions there with the injuries where he's missed time. As you can see in our sheet here, really pushes his grade down below guys like Zach Kuntz, Brenton Strange, and Davis Allen because of the incomplete profile. Where's your favorite fit in this draft for the Bengals, Joe, from a value perspective and a scheme perspective?
Yeah, so let's say I don't want to take a first-round tight end, right? Maybe somebody better at a premium position is available, and you want to go with the pass rusher or the corner or the offensive tackle because one's still there. I completely would get it. I would say, as I made the case earlier, if the best value is in rounds 2 through 4, I end up with a lot of simulation. You know, we use my draft simulators, but I end up with a lot of simulations where Laporta's not there anymore. And I think that could happen. He's got a very strong profile, and especially when stacked up with these other guys. And I like Laporta a lot. I would be more than happy with him at 60. I think he could be a Dallas Clark. We never got to Darnell Washington comparison. I think he's more of a Jermichael Finley mixed with like a Martellus Bennett type. I think Sam Laporta could be Dallas Clark, and I would take that for Joe Burrow. And think
what about Kincaid?
I think the one I keep coming to is a poor man's Kelsey, and I know Kelsey's like the dream, so that's why I think people may take him first in this class because I just natural receiver that can move at a different level than everyone else. Mm-hmm. I think he has that, but I do think Luke Musgrave could be there at 60, and he gets pushed down here, but that's because he didn't play this year, and the previous year he did play when he was 20, not even 21 yet. He was pretty poor still. He played a lot, but he wasn't the developed player. Neither was Dalton Kincaid if we go back 2 years ago. So if we look at Luke Musgrave and he's 6'6", and he's got the best like off the line vertical speed of this entire class, probably the best vertical tight end, that would do a lot for your offense. You're trying to beat cover 2 and scare these guys a little bit. Let Luke Musgrave run down the field, make some dunking on safeties, make some over the rim catches and high point the ball. It's very similarly to what you probably thought you were getting for a lot of years with Tyler Eifert. And I think that could be a value pick if he is still there. It seems like there's a chance for that based on the recent simulations and ESPN's machine that gives it like a 40% chance of him being available at 60. If not, things get dicey. Do you like Tucker Kraft enough? Do you like Zach Kuntz in the third round, Brenton Strange in the third round? I wouldn't take Davis Allen, even though he grades this high. You're not going to get a tight end one that runs a 4.86, even though he's got great hands. He's actually a really good blocker, very good in contested situations. He just cannot run for anything, and that limits him to being a tight end 2. You can't take a guy like that until like the 4th, 5th round at best. So I think it drops off.
You can't?
You cannot.
Has anyone told the Bengals? Oh, strays. Luke Musgrave is really interesting, though. So you're comfortable with Musgrave in the 2nd round, despite the profile questions that you mentioned.
So let's say those top 4 guys are gone, and Tucker Kraft, I could see that being the pick. But if he's gone as well, because I think these guys, the way it grades here says they could all go in the 2nd round, those guys that are 75 and above, if you're watching on YouTube. If it's left with Kuntz, Strange, Allen, Musgrave, Mallory, Schoonmaker, all these guys, right? That next chunk that's rounds 3, 4, maybe even 5. I would like Luke Musgrave over them. Even though it doesn't suggest this, I think the tape, even in his 2 games before he got hurt this year, I thought they looked good. I thought he was ready to explode and break out. And it's a bit of a projection. All of these guys are going to miss one piece of something once you get past that 1st round, and a lot of them in the 1st round are missing it. So you got to be comfortable with, okay, what would it have looked like had he stayed healthy?
Yeah. Mike, what about you? Where's your favorite value alignment for pick, player, all the factors?
If Tucker Kraft is there in round 3, that feels like a really good one to me.
All right. Not 2.
Well, in 2, it's fine.
Right.
But if it could happen in 3, because look, the 70.3 average big board rank, I don't know, maybe something happens, you're a little down the draft. Maybe that's far-fetched. Luke Musgrave, round 2, I do like that a lot. He only played 2 games last year, but he had 169 yards. Like, he was on pace to be one of the top whatever receiving tight ends. And I think he's actually okay as a blocker. A little bit surprising. He's very athletic. It's just there's projection there, and there's a bust chance, and there's, but that's why you take him in round 2, pick 60. Outside of the top 50, that's, I think, probably my favorite if Kraft in round 3 isn't an option. I do like Brenton Strange if he is in round 4. I think he moves pretty well. I liked him more than Kuntz, which I wasn't sure I was going to going in, but I'm just kind of surprised Brenton Strange doesn't have a little bit more hype.
He's Dawson Knox.
Yeah, he actually can block. Like, this is also something I say when I watch Dawson Knox, but hey, he can block a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, especially when he gets on a small guy. He's not the type. There are a few guys in this class, they get on a small guy and they're just kind of like struggling to sustain. And that to me is like, ooh, I'm not sure about blocking in your future, but he's actually bullying those guys. And then he has the weirdest stance though. He's hands on hip, like legs real wide. I think that gets fixed. That'll help him. But yeah, he was interesting. I liked him a lot in round 4. If I'm gonna throw one dart throw in day 3, I think it's Brent Strange round 4.
What about Kuntz, guys? Older, but the 10 RAS, the 100 percentile athleticism, what do you run, a 4.55? It's 6'7". I think he moves well. There's obviously some roughness to his game at Old Dominion, and at 24, you don't necessarily love roughness, but that's the last one let's talk about here. Where are you comfortable with Zach Kuntz?
Yeah, so Kuntz was from Penn State and they transferred. So Brenton Strange beat him out, and he must have been the same recruiter that recruited Mike Gesicki, because that's what he looks like. He's a long gazelle out there running around, and I actually think he's a little bit quicker in and out of breaks than Gesicki is. I think he's a better blocker right now coming out of Old Dominion than Gesicki is right now in the NFL. So I do think he has the potential. Like, if all these guys are gone, the top 4 or 5, he's got the best chance of being a tight end 1, in my opinion, of developing into that and being that guy. He is a really good route runner, really good hands for Old Dominion. I put on the Virginia game, and he catches a lot of balls in that one. And at the end, the last drive, like, they need a few 3rd and 4th down conversions, and then he gets a one-on-one in the red zone for the touchdown to tie the game, and he's got the safety lined up one-on-one on him. He just kills him on just a flag route, but the safety's got no chance. The separation is instant. He jumps up, catches it very naturally, makes sure he gets both feet in. And I'm like, yeah, he can play in the NFL. It looks like he's going to be a fine receiver. If there is another guy, though, where I'm throwing a dart after that, it's Will Mallory out of Miami. Will Mallory probably has the loosest hips out of all these guys, very similar to I talked about Kincaid, where he transitions to a runner. Mallory is lightning quick at that as well, but he also is probably the next best vertical guy after Musgrave, and I think you can split him out wide and run routes against corners, and he did that. And the problem is he got hurt as well, and it's going to knock him down, and he's a little bit older. But I think Will Mallory is at least worth a 4th or 5th round pick if you run it into an emergency scenario.
4.54 at 240 for Mallory. So a little bit on the smaller side there. Guys, we've talked about tight ends for 40 minutes. We could talk longer. We didn't get to Josh Wiley, Luke Schoonmaker, Payne Durham, some other guys that maybe are worth a conversation. If you talk to our guy Jared, who's also watched every trench player in existence, seemingly, he really likes Blake Whiteheart from Wake Forest as well, who's projected to be a later day 3 guy. So unfortunately, we're out of time here for tight ends. Hope that this was an interesting look at the tight end class. We talked mostly about some of the premium guys, got a lot of good conversation about some good fits in different rounds. Hopefully it works out this year. It would be nice to have a tight end that you could see the Bengals try to develop, see if they would want to build an offense around one of these guys a little bit instead of just trying to fit these 1-year guys. I mean, obviously they're not going to be the first choice when you have T. Higgins and Jamar Chase on your team, but have something that you're not just trying to fit a guy in for a year. That would be fun to see what this coach wants to do.
Could potentially be the number 3 option, though, in a year. So, I mean, that is the part about this pick, why it could be a bigger role than I think people are looking at.
Yeah. Going to be very interesting to see how things work out. Positional value definitely plays a part into it as well. We're going to do some more of these roundtables, I think. I think they're fun. I think that there are a lot of prospects, obviously, to talk about. It takes some time to get through them all. So Mike and Joe, find them on Twitter at Joe Goodberry for Joe, at Bengals_Sands for Mike. You'll get all of their respective work on this draft class. We're going to put the sheet out too relatively soon. Soon TM. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. We're back next week with another Mock Draft Monday. Until then, hoo day and have a good one.